Okay, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us for this session. We're very excited to chat with you today. We're glad that you can join us. Today, the topic is the campus of the future, really thinking about what sustainability means for campuses in a very rapidly changing world. So let me just share my screen. I'd like to just jump right in. I have only a couple of slides I'm going to share, and our guests, and we're going to get into some discussions of a very strong interaction from all of you, the audience. And we also are very interested in your opinions and your thoughts, because we're really projecting into the future.
We've lost our host.
All right, sorry. Okay, I think I'm back.
You're back.
Okay, great. If I have a problem with the screen sharing, then I can just drop that. All right, so as I was saying, that we want this to be very interactive, and we would like to have participation from all of the guests and our speakers as well. So let me start off by just talking a little bit about how we got to where we are today. One of the reasons why I started to think about 2050 and the future is because what I realized was that as we were starting to look at our long-term plans, we, just like many other universities, realized that we were projecting to get to a certain point by 2050. And there's a big gap between where we think that we're going to be and where we need to be. According to the science-based targets, this is a problem. And I started to realize that a lot of other universities were doing the same thing. This is just a school, I won't name which one, but it's very typical of many schools all around the world that have very ambitious plans, but there's still a gap. In this case, there's an assumption that there'll be some purchased offsets or renewable energy credits, something like that. And this really bothered me in the back of my mind, and I couldn't quite figure out why, until I realized that the reason why all of these projections and all of these plans look the way they do is because we are all assuming that the world in 2050 will operate a lot like the way it does today, right? Today, we have offsets that are cheap and plentiful and available. And so it's easy for us to think that by 2050, they'll still be cheap and available and plentiful. But perhaps that's not the case. So it led us to start focusing on, if we're going to reach a level of carbon neutrality by 2050, then we first need to think about what does the world look like in 2050, and then we can backcast our way to the decisions that are needed for today. So here's just a couple of things that I've noticed. What does the future hold? By 2030, just less than 10 years from now, there'll be more grandparents than grandchildren, meaning that the demographics are changing. That may have some implications for universities if we're going to have more older people coming perhaps back to universities than younger people. Massive urbanization. This is, as one of my panel members knows, this is what one of the largest cities in China looked like in 1990 and what it looks like roughly today. This, for all of us in Asia, we're seeing this happen on a monumental scale. In fact, one of the statistics that really blows me away is that because of the scope of new buildings that are happening around the world, if you were to put it into context, we're essentially building one New York every month in terms of new building space. So it's massive urbanization. That's going to have an incredible impact on the way that we do business as universities and the places where we live. And then, of course, there's the singularity. So there's estimates that by, let's say, 15 years from now, computers will be as intelligent, machines will be as intelligent as human beings. Now, you might say, well, what's the big deal? I know a lot of dumb people. A machine that's as intelligent as a human might not be so impressive. But keep in mind that a further 10 years after that, so by mid 2040s, maybe 2045, machines will be 1 billion times more intelligent than human beings. And that has to have an impact on the way that we do our business and the way that we learn, the way that we operate. Every single thing in our life, when machines are that intelligent, are going to be impacted. So we need to start thinking about what that looks like for us. As universities, this is our basic value proposition. We offer a credential, we add the education component, and then we add an experience. Take those three divided by your tuition, and then that gives you a good estimate of what your value for money is. And essentially for hundreds of years, this has been the model. But I think what we might need to think about is, are some of these variables a little bit more important than others? Or are some of these variables even going to be a part of the higher ed proposition in the future? We may make an argument that some of those could be actually taken away. So without further ado, I'd like to start with an online poll. I'd like to get everyone to start with this one question. We have 3 polls today. We'll start with the first one, and then I'll introduce their guests, and then we'll get into the conversation. So for everyone who's online, please take just a minute, and as soon as the poll pops up, we'll take about a minute, and I'd like you to just give your best estimate of which is likely in 2050. So try to think about 30 years in advance. Looks like we're getting some good answers. Let's go about another 30 seconds. Okay, if you're almost done, go ahead and hit the submit button, and then I'll end the poll. It looks like most of our participants have answered. All right, while we're wrapping up the last couple of people who are completing the poll, let me just take a minute and introduce our guests. So today I'm very pleased to be joined. Let me introduce myself first. I'll be the moderator. My name is Davis Bookhart, and I'm the director of the Sustainability Net Zero Office at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. And I'll be joined today with 3 really good thinkers on this topic. Let me start with David Galipeau. He's been in a variety of businesses and commercial development for the past 35 years in Canada, Europe, and Asia, both as a corporate executive, .com entrepreneur, and social business innovator. He joined the United Nations, UNAIDS, and UNCTAD in Geneva in 2005, which led him to founding the Social Innovation Entrepreneurship Programs, and most recently, the UN Social Impact Finance Initiative. He's now the co-founder and managing partner of SDGX Group in Singapore with a mandate to research and accelerate and invest in the next generation of technology startups. Next, I'd like to introduce Professor Gray Kokard-Lindgren. Gray is a professor and director of the Common Core at the University of Hong Kong, right down the road from us. After serving as professor of the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences and the inaugural Associate Vice Chancellor of Undergraduate Learning at the University of Washington, Bell, just outside of Seattle, Gray took up the directorship of the Common Core at HKU in 2014. And recently, the Common Core created Unforeseen Circumstance, an online journal and exhibit space. And Gray is now in the midst of designing with students and colleagues critical zones, gender, cities, and well-being, the Passion Project, creating work you love, and a series of undergraduate research initiatives. And then last but not least, I'd like to introduce John Dunn Unsua. He's a professor and deputy director of the CADI editorial project, College of Architecture and Interior Design at Universidad San Francisco de Quito. John Dunn is a full-time professor at the USFQ School of Architecture and Interior Design. He's the former director and coordinator of the USFQ International Workshop of Architecture in the Galapagos. He has a master's in community planning from Auburn University and studied to be an architect at San Francisco de Quito University in 2001. Okay. Why don't I stop there? I'm going to share the results of what we found. And so everyone, you could take a look at this and I'll leave this up on the side. I'm going to stop sharing. But interesting to see the results. I don't think we'll go one by one, but you'll see that in some cases, there's a lot more likelihood, many of you feel likelihood, of some of the answers than others. I think that in terms of the very last question, which is the universities will operate most the same way as we do today, it looks like there was one person who felt that way, but many of the rest of you felt not. All right, so these are just kind of questions. I'll leave those up so you take a chance to look at those. But as you're looking at those, if you have any questions, please write them into the chat. And we'd love to get your ideas in. You're also welcome to raise your hand, but I'd like to encourage you to write the question into the chat first, just to kind of help articulate it. And then once you have it in the chat, either if we have time, I can read it, or if you would like to read it or ask yourself, just raise your hand. Okay, but without further ado, I would like to get my co-panelists to just start off this conversation with some general thoughts from their point of view of what we think is likely to happen between now and 2050. So, David, why don't I start with you? You're in my top left corner, so let's start with you and take a couple of minutes and maybe tell everybody what's on your mind.
Great, thanks a lot, Davis. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, wherever you are. It's a fascinating subject when we start to look at education. One of the core things that a lot of people use as far as getting employment, as far as managing their lives moving forward. But when we look at, let's say, the question about 2050, what do we think work will be like in 2050? And what do we think basic living will be like in 2050? And then let's go back now and say, what do you think education will be like in 2050? And I think that the education system, the way it's structured today, will be eliminated. I think that there will be new forms of education and new things to learn about, new ways of having knowledge in that sense. When we talk about some of the technologies that are going through their very early stages, even though we may think of artificial intelligence, cognitive computing, these types of things are being very onward and very much in the research phase, we are still learning. Artificial intelligence, we're still at the very first steps of artificial intelligence. So where do we think that's going to go? So it sort of redefines what our concept of knowledge is. And it sort of redefines then how do we then attain knowledge and how do we then apply knowledge? Will it be through a standard job, or will it be through something totally different? So in general, when I start to look at the future, and I've got 3 daughters, so I do actually look at the future quite a bit. So when I start to think about the future, I think that what we see right now, as far as having standard universities located geographically, maybe around the world, but still physical campuses, having teachers, professors, lecturers, and a whole abundance of support staff wrapped around them, for them to then start to share what they know to students who are going to start taking that knowledge in. I think that relationship and the power dynamics behind it are going to shift. And I'm seeing this now when I'm doing my own lectures. A lot of times the students know much more about a certain subject than I do. So we're going to start to see that relationship between the student and, let's say, the professor, start that power dynamic relationship, start to shift around, where the students are going to be much more in control as far as setting their curriculum, setting what they want to learn, having an idea of where the future is, selecting the professors, lecturers that they want to learn from, and having a very much a multi-dimensional sort of experience, a scenario, as opposed to reading from textbooks. Having a scenario that they can simply join, let's call it the metaverse or some sort of advanced animation, where they can actually get into a scenario. If they're learning to be an engineer, they actually, in year 1 of their university education, are in a scenario where they're actually working on, let's say, a bridge, designing a bridge structure, or designing something for Mars, who knows, in 2050. So in that sense, I think what we're seeing today is going to be eliminated. And I think there's going to be a brand new thing that's very hard to describe right now, but a brand new sort of environment for learning in 2050.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, David. All right, great. I'd like to turn to you next, if you don't mind. Tell us what's on your mind.
Thanks a lot and welcome to everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here, and welcome my colleagues, Jack and Jeremy as well. I'll just pick up on David's word, multidimensional. If a university is already an assemblage of hardwired infrastructure and curricular and flows of people and money and resources and tasks, then I think this kind of multidimensional assemblage that is a university now will look quite different in the future. And this question that people responded to about whether the campus will be centralized or not is part of what interests me. I think the answer is yes and no, but I think we have to change the imagery away from center, non-center to kind of, as David said, multidimensional pathways and networks. So there will be intensities. I think there will still be intensities in certain places, partly because human beings need that, and partly because of very powerful forces that have entrenched these resources already in certain places, and they serve multiple purposes. But I think each stage of knowledge production and what it means to be a professor or a teacher or a co-learner, what it means to be a student, and how we distribute the learning task, again, as David was saying, will be radically different. So for me, I think that learning as a whole, both during that traditional time period of 18 to 22, let's just say, but also, as we'll talk about, I'm sure, much different kind of iterations of learning later in life will begin to look quite different. And so things will not be organized, I think, in departments, but in around project challenges. We've got to learn better how to articulate questions and then begin to assemble provisional teams to respond to those questions at different stages with different levels of expertise and so forth. So I agree that we're really in a period of tremendous creative flux, and there's enormous opportunities that all of us are already working on in our campuses now and beyond. So I think many of those trends will be accentuated, inflected in more sophisticated ways, and sort of reorganized so that students and professors and colleagues and partners and and so forth, have a better sense of that multi-dimensional scenario that's being constructed as we go. There will need to be structures in place for that credentialization to continue. But I think it'll look quite different as well. So thank you so much. Just some initial thoughts.
That's great, thanks. And I was just looking at the poll. It sounds like the majority of the people on Zoom today are agreeing, likely or extremely likely, to one of the questions about kind of this idea of decentralizing. It's kind of spreading out, which I think really gets to the point of dimensional education experience. So I think we're all kind of heading in that way. John Dunn, how about you? Give us your thoughts from your perspective.
Thank you, Davis. Thank you, everyone, for being here. It's a pleasure to be here discussing this important topic with David and Ray. My view goes pretty much on the same path, I think. When we talk about this evolution of the university and the campus going into more network structure around the world, it's inevitable to understand that that already has occurred. It has been pushed through the conditions that we have passed in the last pandemic. It's interesting, I was noticing, for example, that in the first question that we have, for example, the people was considering that the 33% of the people was considering that the idea that universities will be totally become extinct as we know them, it's gonna be unlikely for them. And pretty much that gives me the impression that pretty much the idea of this, the evolution that we're gonna have on the education, and especially on the university education, it's gonna be in between all the innovations that we have been through and all the innovations that we're gonna have in the future because unexpected circumstances. And the idea that, for example, the education on the university relies so much on tradition and many aspects till today. So probably the things that are gonna be pretty much like is that all these scenarios presented by David and Gray will be working as they were mentioned, but that would be combined with some other conditions that will persist since the beginnings of the structures of the university from the Middle Ages in Europe till today. So that's one of the things that comes to my mind. And also, I think that that will open and make a wider gap between the avant-garde universities that we will have in Asia, Europe, North America, and the concept, the old-fashioned concept of the university that we will have in the developing countries. So that, I think, is gonna make some kinds of coexistence between the concepts that we have, or the structures of the educational concepts that we have from the last century and the ones that will come to the next years and the next decades in 2015. The other thing that comes to my mind is also that all this structure that we are envisioned for the future, how is it going to be? It's going to be kind of not necessarily linear as we're thinking right now. One of the things that I've been working is the impact that may Black Swan events have in architecture and also in urban planning. And it's interesting to see that we have been through one of the biggest Black Swan events. The COVID was actually one of the biggest Black Swan events that we've been through. And actually, that's the reason that we have this conference, this meeting in the way that we're having this format of a conference by Zoom. What would be the unexpected issues that we have not foreseen yet that may rearrange the way in which we are educating ourselves, in which we are educating the undergrads, the masters that are coming into the future? I think that there might be some other surprises that we have not seen yet, as we haven't seen COVID 2 years ago. That would be the thoughts that I would like to share with you, my friends.
Yeah, thank you, John. And I'm so glad that you brought that up about, this whole idea of the Black Swan events. And the fact is, this is the reason I think we're talking about this today. What you're referring to as a Black Swan event, let's say what we're dealing with right now, COVID. The fact is, people were talking about global pandemics for the past decade or so. People have been saying they're coming, they're coming, they're coming. This is not new, but we were still completely taken by surprise and we were completely unprepared. And I think that's really the the shot across the bow for all of us in the universities. I think that we're saying this is coming. This is coming. We need to pay attention. We know that and it's. I guess I'd love to get some thoughts, John. What you were kind of what you were kind of pointing at was that, for hundreds and hundreds of years, you're referring back to in time into the European tradition. We're talking about 800 years, maybe 1,000 years, to some of the oldest universities. And for all of that time, they all had two things in common. Number one, there was a single source of knowledge, and that one person was more valuable than anything else in the world because that person knew everything. And secondly, you needed to have bricks and mortar for that person and everyone around that person. It could be in an open air bazaar like in ancient Greece, but it had to be someplace. Both of those things, I think, we're dismantling. And so, so how do we dismantle those, or maybe they're being dismantled? Maybe I should say it that way. So, how do we make this transition and end up with a soft landing? We don't end up getting slapped like we did with COVID. Anyone who would like to jump in, please. Yeah, please go ahead, John.
No. Gray was just about to give us some fresher feedback. So please go ahead, Gray.
Just very briefly, I think we have to keep thinking about that relationship between tradition and its multiple meanings and how to create different new spaces, because there's always going to be this movement, and we have a chance to do it a bit more consciously than has been done in other periods. So I think history is not going to disappear.
I agree with that. I think, Davis, I think that there's going to be some dialectical condition in which you can juxtapose the traditional vision of the university campus as the thesis and all these new networking system in which we're working. We all are working on that new formats that are going to be combined. So for me, the idea that it's going to happen pretty much, especially in the old universities, it's that there's going to be some kind of evolution of the tradition, so to say. I think that's going to be one of the things that might be evolving that part. So tradition is going to take from the university campus, from the university building, from the classroom to the Zoom, pretty much. And I think many of those traditions will have the expressions, the new versions of those expressions and traditions are going to be in the new formats. So they're going to have some process of adaptation, pretty much.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, everyone who is participating online, please, I'd like to encourage you, if you have any thoughts, feel free to put a question or a comment into the chat. We'll try to incorporate that into our discussion as well. So I think that we're kind of leading towards the student experience. So, and David, I know you've got a lot to say about that. So what I'd like to do now is let Jen, if we could go ahead and launch the second poll. So everyone who's online today, I'd like you to consider this question. In 2050, what will the student experience be like? And here it is. Let's just take a minute or two and put in your answers. Thank you. Just take a little bit longer if you're wrapping up the questions? Great. We've got some good stuff coming here. Okay. All right, if you're still doing it, we'll leave the poll open. Please, continue to finish the questions. And also in the meantime, if you see any of these questions and if you are one of the extremely unlikely or extremely likely, and if you have, some thoughts about why it's so unlikely or why it is likely, please put your thoughts in the comments. We'll bring that into the conversation. So David, while we'll give everyone just a few more, another minute or so to kind of wrap that up, but let's transition to the student experience and maybe tell us your thoughts on that.
I think when it comes down to the student experience, I mean, just to step back a bit, I think when we go and we're being educated, we have this common concept of book smarts and street smarts. So book smarts, what you learn in theory, what you get out of textbooks, and then street smarts, what you learn on the streets, what you experience and what you do. And quite honestly, when we start to move into concepts of the technocracy, where a lot of this advanced technology will be taking over a large part of our purpose in life, I'm seeing a shift back towards the humanities. I would like to see a shift actually back towards the humanities, life skills, soft skills, these types of things. And these are the areas that are very hard, in my opinion, to learn in books. You have to experience them. Negotiation, how to navigate the future world, these types of things. And that's why I'm interested in the first question, where we have this virtual environment where these scenarios can be created. And I think the way that students are going to define that, as opposed to sort of selecting from a menu of courses, is co-designing courses with professors or educators that act as mentors or coaches and sort of co-design what they want to put together. I mean, as a young person, you're not exactly sure, you don't have that life experience, you don't know what's coming ahead. As an older person or as an educator, you may have that experience, but you don't really know what the young generation is feeling. So the co-creation of curriculum built around sort of virtual experiences where you can get the theory as well as get a lot of the hands-on experience within the virtual environment. That's where I think the student experience is going to be. And I think that's where it's going to be. It's going to be a lot more, I think, student driven, let's say, in that situation. Even if it's in a structured university setting, I think it's going to be a lot more student driven.
Okay. Well, it certainly makes sense. We're coming out of this COVID. Many of us have been teaching online. And so clearly we can do it. But we realize that there's something big missing. And so I think that something big missing is what you're describing. It's kind of the soft skills, those life skills, those interaction skills, for students, sometimes it's even just conflict skills, I mean, he ate my sandwich, I left it in the refrigerator, how do you resolve those kinds of things? That's kind of part of the university experience, is how do you start to make your own decisions in life, navigate your way through. So, all right, yeah, thanks, David. I'm going to end the poll so that everyone can see it. Jocelyn, I saw your note. I think is now I can share the results. I think everyone should be able to see it. Can everyone see the results? Okay. All right, so the results, you should be able to, kind of scroll your way through them on your own if you like. So let's just start with the first one. The first one, I think, this was something that you had raised, David, and it looks like 80% of the people online are agreeing with you, either likely or extremely likely. So it sounds like we kind of all have a general consensus. There's a couple of people not sure, and maybe one or two who feel like it's unlikely, but the vast majority of people feel like we're heading in that direction. So Gray, if that really is the case, if we're headed towards this kind of you know, student-driven experience, then what does it look like as a student? Does a student just apply the same way that they do, or do they apply to multiple institutions and they pick and choose?
Good question. I think this, what John said about an in-between state is going to be important to keep thinking about. And I think this idea of a rearrangement of a kind of hierarchical priority of knowledge that we briefly indicate by the words hard and soft skills, which are always hierarchical and not just neutral, that's going to change in terms of the student experience. And I think for myself and some of our colleagues here, and many of you, I'm sure, that one way to get into this space is to base more and more of the learning on project-based learning. That will change the relationship of what we call a teacher, what we call a partner, what we call multidisciplinary teams, and what we call a student. And I agree that the more student-initiated, student-driven projects there can be, that's a good thing, but they need a lot of help in terms of articulating that. And so I think as, that question of student experience is directly connected to postgraduate training of future teachers. And that, I think, really has not received sufficient attention around the world. Undergraduate education has changed quite significantly in many contexts, but postgraduate, not so much, for good reasons related to specialization and all that. So you have to build a system that accounts for necessary specializations of knowledge. These are complicated questions to address, but from a different perspective of kind of a collaborative team learning that can move in and out of the virtual world. David's talked about this transition space and learning to navigate that transition space between the virtual and the physical. We're doing a lot around here on gamification. And then I think on the macro scale, somebody raised this question earlier, there needs to be deep thought about ease and equality of access, so that there are possibilities not just for the students with the most wealth to do these things, but that we distribute. It's now distributable. So how do we do that in a more equitable way? And obviously that raises huge geoeconomic questions and so forth. But I do think that, what we're seeing is that students crave these projects. And if they're well structured across time, different years, and then iterations long after their traditional undergraduate years, it's not just upskilling. I'm interested in upskilling, but I don't think that's the answer for universities. I think it is an ongoing collaborative building of projects and these design scenarios that David and John mentioned earlier. So yeah, in general, and thank you to everybody for your questions. And please, you guys are the experts, so zip those questions into the chat box.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so we were just seeing some from Sarah Bannon, and you were addressing one of the questions, which is kind of lowering the barriers. We do have a system right now that is based on prestige and rankings and things like that. It seems like that really is under threat, I believe. And so maybe that does. John, what do you think? Do you think that we're able, does this kind of democratize the learning experience? You don't have to be at a top ranked, expensive university. You can be at, now, it's the experience that matters, and the ability to kind of choose your path that matters, as opposed to kind of a credential from one of the blue chip universities.
Pretty much like that. And the previous poll, I was bringing the relevance of traditions that I think that will still on the campus. But however, I think that the structure in the way the student is going to form himself is going to be completely rearranged. And let me go just a little further. Let's try not to speak only about the student experience. What is going to be the final project of that education? What is going to be the professional profile of those persons? I don't think that it's going to be like the ones that we have nowadays. I don't think that it's not necessarily going to be labeled as one specific name as architect, engineer, doctor. I think that maybe that's going to be one of those bases. Maybe one of these areas are going to be the strongest on this development. But I think that the academic grid, as the way that we know it today, in which is like a tree shape with the branches in which you have a sequence to go one after another, it's going to be completely rearranged. Maybe it's not going to be necessarily with continuity from one class to another. The thing that looks to me that comes in the future is that we're going to have an academic grid that is much more like a mosaic, and in which you have the possibility to rearrange and pick some other personal options that goes according to your attitudes, to your skills, to your preferences. So in that case, that comes to my mind is that maybe in the future, those advances that we have been discussed with David and Gray are going to reinforce the vision of the university much more based on liberal arts than compare with the other universities that are much more in a polytechnic structure or in a management structure. So the people that it's going to be specialized, it's going to be much more like the way they want to be specialized on a specific profession. And let me just, before I finish, bring the example that I have in my own profession as an architect, as an urban planner. Architecture is a profession that is actually in a huge crisis worldwide. Each day that passes, the huge projects needs less architects, and the architects are facing the situation in which they have to expand the development of the profession beyond the build-up form. So I don't see as something unusual that maybe in the future architects may be called or a contract just to rearrange the way in which a company is organized, like an organigram. That's things I think may be one of the possibilities that may come. And for example, just to finish this, architecture will also, from the perspective that I've seen, not only here in Ecuador, around the world, is that it's becoming something pretty much like medicine. Like the undergrad is going to be like the first step, but it's not going to give you enough resources to go to the outside world until you have a master's degree that gives you some specialization. Finally, just to end it, there are new ways to develop and to go into the market and get a way to just find the gap that in which you can fill up. For example, in my case, I have been working some classical usual design works and processes, but for example, the way I've been approached to architecture and also to the urban scale is much more through the use of the word, through the writing. So pretty much the idea or the notion that architecture, planning, the city, the urban scale needs to be written, for example, is the one that gives me another space to work in which I'm just filling one void that existed actually in the local market. I think that there might be some other similar situations in some other conditions that are not the usual conventional view of architecture. And I think that it's happening not only in my profession, in my career, it's going to happen in the practice of mostly all the known professions we have today.
I agree. You're probably seeing it first because your work spans such a long time frame, but I think you're kind of at the vanguard of seeing the trend. So, all right, just maybe one or two more questions about the student experience. And then what we really want to do is start translating this into our sustainability focus, which is what does all this mean as we're trying to transition towards a net zero campus or net zero university? How do we protect our university from going extinct? Many people think they will be going extinct. So I guess there are a couple of questions. I'll throw them out there. Gray, I remember you had some ideas. You were thinking that maybe this traditional bachelor's, master's, PhD program, maybe that whole thing gets restructured. Maybe we're actually looking at something that's a little bit more spread out. Masters and bachelors are all kind of combined. What did you have in mind for that? Is that a way of recognizing that people need to be able to spread out the experience over time, or do you think that just the idea of all these individual specialized degrees are not
Well,
as.
I think, as everybody said, we're rethinking the meaning of sequence, and we're rethinking the meaning of structure and times and spaces, let's just say. So right, I agree with John that a bachelor's degree for many professions is not going to be enough. And then the question becomes, how do you structure in a realistic manner a more extended thing without just, you know, wearing people out and they're not making money and so forth and so on. I like the Dutch model right now, that it's quite easy to go seamlessly from a bachelor's to a master's degree. And I would add to that what we've already said before, that it depends on how that's structured. And it's not one block of sequential knowledge after the other, but it's a much richer learning environment based around things people care about, and then finding the resources to respond in a sophisticated manner. So just to repeat myself, I think we have to keep thinking about how do we build up sophistications of what we can still call specialties, but they're not silos anymore. They're always in interaction with other groups. And I think, and so that's just one stage of it. PhDs are an entirely other thing that we can talk longer about later. But I think for people coming back in their 40s and 50s and 60s and 100s, that it has to be a rich learning environment related to things that are important to them, so that a value becomes the basis of activity rather than this kind of abstract imposition of here's what you need to know. Sometimes we need those things, obviously.
Yeah.
So again, it's this push and pull between what's already in place and what all of us in this Zoom room are already reinventing. And then finding the will, the resources, the colleagues to just keep up the experimentation at every level. I really like the word experimentation, and I think all of education should be that in different ways. So too much, but anyway, I think there's a lot of opportunity here.
Yeah, I agree. I like that you're, that you also kind of reminded us about kind of the lifelong learning aspect of this. And I think that clearly is the case. A couple of statistics, a child born today has more than a 1 in 3 chance of going well past their 100th birthday. We know that the demographics are changing. We're getting older and we're having less children. So there's simply, from just a market dynamics point of view, there's just going to be more customers at the upper end of age scales. And we also know that statistically speaking, a person graduating today is likely to change their careers 6 times, not just from one job to the next, but completely change careers 6 times, meaning every single time they need some additional micro credentialing or some, additional kind of top off, to use that term. So, David, I'd like to, with that context, I wonder if you think that there's a bit of a conflict here, because what we're saying is we want students to have, full flexibility. They chart their own course. They're in charge of everything. And then I think, well, when I was 18, I didn't know what the hell I wanted to do. You give me the chance to chart my own course, it'll be, who knows where it will go. And then of course, recognizing that people will be coming back in their 30s, their 40s, their 50s, they're always going to be coming back. So in your mind, how does that all come together, giving the students the flexibility even when they may not even know what they want to do with their life?
I think certainly the traditions are going to live long, but I think some of the traditions are going to break down. For example, when you get to grades or certifications, a bachelor's, a master's, a PhD, and these types of things. I mean, when I was a kid, I actually skipped 2 grades. Nowadays, they don't do that anymore, but I was allowed to learn at the capacity that I could learn at. So I was allowed to skip and jump grades to move ahead. So when I entered university, I was rather young. So, and I think that flexibility is going to start to come back, where it's not going to be an age structure around what high school, bachelor's. I think, as Gray was saying, there's going to be a universal flow. So it's not going to be sort of bachelor's, master's. I think at a bachelor's level, you will be able to take master's programs. and work it back. So I think the gradient between a bachelor's and a master's and PhD is going to be very gray. And you may put off a bachelor's and you may receive your bachelor's and master's actually at the same time, or within a few months of each other, depending on how you build up your credits. So I think that flow is going to move very easily. And then touching a little bit on what John was saying, I think that sort of fits into it where, I mean, at my age, I don't know what I want to do. I mean, I've done all my so-called formal education, but at my age, and it's not a matter of having 6 careers within a lifespan. I mean, I actually have 3 or 4 careers at the same time right now, and I'm able to do that. And I think so. I think the decentralization is going to help with that, because if I want to learn about behavioral economics, I can simply go online and learn about it without going through a formal structure. I won't get, the sheepskin. I don't get the certificate, but I can learn about different pieces of what I need to actually then now continue my so-called careers moving forward. And I think there will be some so-called black swan sort of events coming up. I mean, ruralization, the research is starting to show that there's going to be a shift away from urbanization towards ruralization. And how is that going to impact the way that governments, it's much easier to manage 1 million people in the city than 1 million people spanned over a complete district or province, because the infrastructure costs, everything is much more expensive to do things of that nature. So this push towards ruralization, what does that mean for a lot of careers? And then obviously you get in traditional careers of medicine, the professions, if you will, those are falling apart. As you said, Davis, earlier, what if there is a standard computer intelligence application that is 1 billion times smarter than what we are? Well, we're going to rely on it. And that's going to do all the heavy lifting. And so that's why I think the humanities are going to come back into play, that people's careers in the future won't be so much doing things as managing things. And that's a different type of skill, negotiation skill, working with relationships, these different types of things, working within crisis when things don't happen. How do you react to that? And going back to COVID, we knew what was happening. That wasn't the issue. The issue was we weren't prepared. So the question is now for students, how are they going to prepare themselves? Because I can't rely on an educator to prepare me. It's just too broad. My life is too broad. And I think young people today have very wider lives than me growing up in a small village in rural Canada. They have a much broader lives. They have friends around the world, friends they don't even know they know around the world, where the only friends I had as a kid, if I couldn't touch you, I didn't know you. Because it was the kids around my neighborhood. That was it. There was no internet. But now you can know people around the world. You build relationships around the world. They all have different definitions. But I think the relationship between employer and employee is going to change. Between learner and learnee is going to actually change as well. So all these dynamics, I think, are going to get into a situation, a crisis point, a perfect storm, as John was saying, with this so-called black swan is going to be a social or a cultural event that's going to attack tradition, as opposed to attacking, let's say, curriculum or formal situations.
Yeah, good. Yeah, well said. I think, one of the things that we've learned is that we can do things apart, we can work apart, so businesses are allowing employees to work from home, some of them remotely, 100% remotely, they don't show up, which is fine. Lots of really interesting sustainability implications for that in terms of utilization of space and transportation and so forth. But the one thing that I think that we are anticipating as well, though, is that kind of those bonds with your workmates are going to be much weaker. Obviously, you're not kind of running into them in the hallway and having those water cooler. And I think that goes back to one of your original points, David, about maybe the university, really focusing on those life skills, soft skills, communications, networks. That's really where if people are going to be, going into this ruralization, as you mentioned, or working from home, there might be a bit of an isolation. We need to train students how to be able to do that. So, all right, I have one more question that I'd like to ask everyone to participate in. So Jen, if you don't mind, if you could put up our third and final poll question. And the question is this: in 2050, what kinds of changes will materially impact our campus climate and sustainability targets. So that's where we're leading all this discussion about what the student experience will be and what we're going to, what we anticipate at the campus or the university of the future. What we really need to do is start to think about how does that impact us as we're starting to make decisions about how to build new buildings, right? We have lots of new construction going on. How do we renovate our buildings? How do we plan for, those carbon reductions that I started off with? How do we get to that point where we're eliminating that unknown gap that we think that we'll be buying offsets for? So if we anticipate this correctly, then maybe we can avoid all of those offsets by what we do. All right, so take just a few minutes, and if you don't mind, go ahead. I see some of you have already completed. Good for you. Okay, looks like many of you have finished. A couple of you are still working on that. Let me just throw the first question for everyone. Let me just throw it out to our panel members. The classrooms will be replaced by networks and communities, requiring classrooms to be redesigned as co-working and living spaces. I know that the poll is still open, but it looks like the majority of people feel like that's either likely or extremely likely. So I think we all kind of get the idea that, the classrooms, lecture theaters, things that we have right now are going to have to be radically reformed, changed, altered, eliminated, something. John, I'd like to start with you since, with your architecture perspective, we've got a lot of existing buildings here that are all designed to do things that we're kind of feel like we're not going to be using them for in the future. So how do we deal with that?
Well, in that part, I think that we have some sort of mixture. First of all, if the vision that David and Gray and we all have been explaining, which the university is going to rely much more in networking and connecting with some other peoples around the world, much more than gathering into a building. It is true that the idea of the physical campus, the materialized, the build-up campus, it's going to be largely reduced. Maybe I think that one of the things that are going to happen in that condition is that we're going to find some adaptations of the existing spaces and the existing buildings that are going to be rearranged. Last time that we were speaking with you, Davis, I think you remember we were discussing what happens in architecture when you replace the term of function for the term use. So if you have the idea of use instead of function, you have the build-up form could be much more adaptable to some other sources. However, I think that all the rearrangements that we have in the build-up form in the campus are actually gonna rely on the rearrangements that we make on the education systems, on the way in which we're gonna educate people. And something that David just said before rang the bell to me and was very interesting when he was mentioning something that I'm sure we all have done here in this meeting, talking about the idea that when you have to learn something new, you go by your own, you have all the resources online and you make your research. What would happen if suddenly the university of the future of the 2050 is not going to be the one that teaches you, but the one that certifies that you, through your own resources, have learned the things that you're required to learn. So maybe the university keeping some sorts of traditions and some other things, it's gonna be able to be present, but not necessarily to be the one who gives you all the education, but just to confirm that you have been through your own process of education. However, I do not think that the build-up campus is going to disappear at all, because even in the physical campus, you have some other things that I found kind of hard just to leave behind in terms of tradition, even some things that may be called as rituals. For example, the ceremony of a graduation, I think it's going to happen somewhere. And some other terms or some other activities required to have some place to get to gather with the students or maybe among faculty staff. The American architect Louis Kahn used to say when he was explaining an educational project he developed that he considered that he wanted on each classroom he was designing and building that classroom should evoke the place that was just under the shade of a tree, in which a teacher was teaching without knowing that he was a teacher, and the students were gathering around him learning without knowing that they were the students. So maybe this dematerialization that we've been through and that we're going to continue further in the future, it's going to be much more like that. But space, it's going to be still something relevant, but in a different way, in a different relevance, even in scale and also in the way we use it.
David, we are, so building on what John was just saying, it's just so fascinating. It's one of those, those really fragile eggs. Once you crack it open, it's going to be hard to put back together. But I mean, what John is saying is that, our campuses that we're nurturing and putting so much time into, we may be putting, we may be putting our money into the wrong thing, or at least in the future. And I think that if you look at, so I know that Gray and I are in Hong Kong. You spend time in Singapore and Bangkok, David. Very expensive cities, not getting any cheaper. And so, there's another dimension to what John is saying, which is, it actually would be kind of very advantageous for us to spread out because, there's some cost savings involved as well. So, David, give us your.
Well, I'm thinking, and John may like this idea, but what if you're looking at the traditional buildings at each of your universities and the interiors are actually redesigned like a holodeck, going back to Star Trek, John, like a holodeck. And these sort of rooms, these classrooms, built like a holodeck. So they're virtual spaces. You can actually enter them physically, but what you would experience, whether with lens or something much more internal, you would experience, let's say, an environment. And that environment could be outside, inside a classroom, a work office, whatever it could be. And let's assume that you can stitch these together, that there may be a physical space in Hong Kong, a physical space in Quito that can actually stitch together to make one class. And though there may be people physically in Hong Kong or physically and around the world, they have a simulation that they are actually in class. And this research is actually ongoing right now. There is actually research similar to this going on right now in looking at how do you stitch these spaces together. And you can walk into them and meet physical people as well as meeting virtual people all at the same time. So it's a sort of a multi-sensorial sort of experience that you're having at the same time. Now let's take that and let's now look at the concept of digital twins. So I create a digital avatar of myself. I send that one person to one class, another one of myself to a different class. They're learning two different things. They report back to me. So now I have multiple personas learning multiple things in multiple areas. And imagine that experience, how quickly I could learn. Now, imagine a 12-year-old person doing this, right? But imagine how quickly you could learn and everything else. And it almost goes back to what is home learning now, right? So as I think John was saying, when you learn from home, you learn from wherever you learn from, but you go to a branded or ranked school to get certified. You do the exams or the test there, and you get certified. So, and you pay for that price, right? So I think these types of environments are really interesting. And believe me, there is experimentation going on right now at MIT and some of the other schools on these types of environments and what it means. And I'll just say one last thing. 3 things really sort of twisted my mind over the last 30, 40 years. I remember when the internet was first coming out in the mid-'80s. I was working on a DARPA project, and they gave the internet to the astronauts, and the astronauts were playing around with this internet, and they were very good. And the conclusion was that astronauts are smart. In reality, the conclusion was false. What they later found out was that astronauts move in a 3-dimensional world. They're not on a 2-dimensional plane like we are. So they navigate and they think about things differently. So they could navigate the internet really easily because they understand that other dimension. And the other thing is 2 studies that we did, this is in the early 2000s, but one was a virtual environment classroom where some students self-identify. They have a profile picture, the gender, these types of things. And another class where they do not self-identify. You could be a cactus, you could be a dog, it really doesn't matter. The learning experience in the class that doesn't self-identify was much richer and higher because of the political biases. You wouldn't avoid answering or avoid asking questions if you are a woman, if you are a minority, these types of things. So it takes all that bias out. And then the third thing that really sort of shook me was we started teaching backwards to younger kids. So starting at the end of a textbook and moving up to chapter 1, showing videos or movies, the end of the movie first and moving backwards. And that type of learning experience for non-linear thinkers, for multidimensional thinkers, which kids are nowadays, is a much richer experience because you're constantly asking why. You know what happened, but why did that happen? You're moving backwards. So you start to dig into your mind a bit differently. So these 3 different types of things with this new type of environment really sort of expresses a much different approach to education and architecture and sustainability, to touch back on sustainability, a much different approach to sustainability than simply something called the circular economy or something of that nature.
Yeah. No, I love that whole idea. In fact, I guess in some ways, that's kind of what we're trying to do here. We're trying to get to the end, right? And for us right now, the end is 2050. And then think like, how did we get there and why? Why did things happen, or why will things happen? So yeah, I think that's terrific. Gray, we have a couple of comments here about about the campuses. I think that Jocelyn's is saying that things like laboratories are always going to be virtual. Although I would say that one of the big projects that we have here at UST is looking at the metaverse and how much of that kind of stuff could be incorporated in. We did talk about the intelligence of machines. We know that we don't actually test nuclear weapons anymore. That can all be virtually done through computer simulations. We don't crash cars anymore. Automobiles, they used to have this crash test dummies. They don't do those anymore. That's all done through simulations. So where is the line in your mind, Gray, about how much has to be done in a physical campus and how much even the simulations could be done on the cloud. The data center could be hundreds of kilometers away. So even that, the data center doesn't even have to be on the campus, really.
Yeah, so I have no idea where the lines are in my mind. That's an ongoing question. And I think we need about 4 more hours to keep talking about these fantastic topics. As Davis mentioned, there is enormous physical construction going on both of our campuses and in Hong Kong. That's sped up, if anything. So something's going on there that we'll have to take account of. And I think that, Jocelyn's comment about labs need to be physical, and then Davis, your response to that to begin, I think if we think about a studio in an artistic architectural sense, and a lab in whatever scientific sense you prefer to think about it, and project-based learning, then that begins to get at the sustainability question and the project-based learning question and the collaborative team question and so forth. But I'm not, so part of what worries me is the organizational structures of universities tend to reproduce themselves. And so where are these kind of trajectories that are moving? It's from the outside world considerably, but how do you design an organization that's flexible enough to do the things we're talking about and cares enough about climate change? I mean, you know, everybody can make whatever noises they choose, but construction, you know, proceeds apace. And I think this idea that we're talking about digital twins, and digital, it's not just twins, it's multiples. And that is a space in which what we can still call the humanities and social sciences and anthropology and so forth can be part of this discussion, because immediately a movie was mentioned. That's not accidental. And there's a whole history of science fiction. That's not accidental. So somehow, if we're going to incorporate these newly designed humanities, social sciences, anthropology, et cetera, you know, it's going to bear on the questions that we're living out as we talk today. It's not going to be simply an archive that's consulted anymore. And then finally, I mean, just to bring it back to sustainability, Davis and I are on a part of a group called the Hong Kong Sustainable Campus Consortium. And that's a fantastic cross-city organization. So you have to invent new organizations, you have to invent new job titles, you have to invent new uses, John, as you were saying. And then just from where I sit in this particular organization, to think about the SDGs as a framing for curriculum that will deepen student experience tangibly and in a differentiated manner about these large questions of sustainability. They need to be sort of singularized and differentiated experience with a broader scope of impact. And so how do you get at that? And one way we do that is in multiple ways to think about the SDGs. So anyway, that's one line in my mind, but it's pretty tangled.
All right, well, it's a good line. It's a good line. It's well, it's multiple lines, I guess, you know, and I think in terms of how we, you know, how we're kind of focusing on this, you know, it's interesting you brought up the SDGs when you talk about 2050. We're actually going beyond the SDGs. Maybe it's SDG Part 2. I assume there'll be a 2.0 version of the SDGs that'll come out with, you know, even more aggressive targets. So we're not even sure, you know, what our highest priorities might be, let's say 10 or 15 years from now. But I think, John, I want to return back to you, because you're, you know, as an architect, I keep thinking in terms of how we, you know, how do we, you know, we're navigating our way forward. For those of us who are, you know, so some of us wear two hats. You know, I'm kind of focusing on the operations of the university. I work on education and research as well, but wearing the operations hat, we're making decisions right now that are going to go well beyond 2050. You know, a new building today will last 75, 100 years. That's blowing way past our 2050 carbon neutral. The buildings that we're building, you know, are going to have embodied carbon, you know, even if we could reduce that as much as we possibly can. There's just a lot of big impacts. Our university is now 30 years old. We're still fairly young in terms of what universities look like compared to Hong Kong U. But the practical, you know, practically speaking, 30 years, that's some pretty old, tired stuff in this building, you know, and especially laboratories. A 30-year-old laboratory is not a bright, young laboratory anymore. But you know, we've got to make some big decisions about what we do. Do we just go ahead and, you know, Jocelyn was saying in her comment that she feels like laboratories are going to continue to be an important part. Well, if that's the case, then we should renovate those laboratories and anticipate that we're going to be using them for the next 30 years. But that's a big investment, and that's it's a big bet that we are going to continue to use them. Versus, if we think that a lot of this will become virtualized, a lot of this will go onto the cloud, a lot of this will be simulated, then that's a whole lot of space. So, how do we start to, I guess the question is, from, as an architect, you're trained to kind of look into the future. How do we start to make good decisions today that we know are going to go way past 2050 and try to kind of hedge our bets a bit so that we still can have those laboratories if we need them, but we can eliminate them or transition away from them if we don't?
Well, I think there's going to be like a mixture of both scenarios. Pretty much, let's take a look to the laboratories in the same way that you can have the vision of a surgery room, in which if you're going to make some surgery to a patient, that space needs to exist as material, as an existent, a build-up space. But of course, you try to make that space is going to advance in the same way that the medical and surgical technology does. So, in the other hand, as you are having some of those spaces build up in the real world, I think that is going to coexist with another kind of classroom just beside of it, pretty much as David was mentioning. The comment that David was doing about the idea of a virtual classroom in which I can be physically, but I can interact with some other students that they are virtually connected from some other part of the world. It's quite interesting because the way of understanding the classroom on that way turns the educational space into a new communication media. So space is not only a point of gathering, it is like the new way in which we may connect with some other persons through not only the experience of learning, but the experience of knowledge exchange between the persons that are just gathering in that room. So taking the core of your question, Davis, I think that the perspective that you have to keep on both scenarios, the one that relies much more on the build-up existing form and the other that is much more virtual, both require to be flexible. They require to be easy to adapt to new needs, to new requirements that we don't even know that they exist. It is interesting, and I go back once again to the part of function, that when you look through the history of architecture, those buildings that are actually part of the general knowledge that came from hundreds and thousands years ago are the ones that could survive just because they just leave the primary function they were built up for. Let's put an example. The Castle of San Angelo in Rome. It was a mausoleum. It was a mausoleum of the Roman Emperor Adrian. But later it came in and it was turned into a papal residence. So those rearrangements are the ones that helps that the buildings, the interiors can endure in the future. So I think both, not only the ones that are just built, but the ones that are conceived in the metaverse or virtuals, those requires to be flexible. Those have to adapt in the future for those needs that we don't know that we're going to have in the future.
Right. David, yes.
I just want to jump on what John was saying. I mean, when you look at, as an architect, let's even go beyond that. Let's call it a spatial engineer. So you are engineering spaces. It moves, and you're exactly right. It moves beyond form, even physical, into things of communication and all these other things, the other senses that come into this sort of thing. And I think even if you look at the SDGs were created for development practitioners. But when it comes into development finance, for example, the SDGs were not designed for investors. So there's a big confusion around how do I do impact investing? How do I measure the impact of my investments? And they weren't designed for students. So they weren't designed in a learning program with the perspective on future careers. Or what is my life going to be in the future? What is sustainability going to mean to me now? But what is it going to mean to me in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years when I have family, these types of things. So as a spatial engineer, and I think the key is spatial humanities, spatial R&D. I mean, these different types of things. I mean, it changes the whole dynamic of a lot of the core subjects when you introduce this concept of space. The space is being redefined out of 2 and 3 dimensions into multiple dimensions and bring it that way. And just to touch on the other thing, I think schools, universities that are well funded, right? They've got large trust funds and these types of things. The physical space is going to continue, but the pressure on academic funding now is really, really tight. A lot of schools just simply cannot afford to build new. So they're going to have sort of these multi-rentable places, holodecks, if you will, but multi-rentable places that they're going to sort of leverage. So I think the physical spaces from the branded universities, they have enough money to maintain their brands. So they will continue and they will maybe be the certifiers later on, offering that certification. But I think they're still going to have physical spaces where I think, unfortunately, a lot of the underfunded academic institutions will not be able to afford to maintain, just at the energy cost and everything else, will not be able to afford a really nice physical space and may very quickly jump into a virtual spaces, adding much more pressure than on the branded schools or the well-funded schools.
Well, that's a good point. When I kind of started off today, I showed that that equation of the credential plus experience plus education divided by your tuition, and the smaller places are going to be hit by that the hardest, because the large institutions with big endowments, they're going to be able to continue to invest in experience. The ones without as much money, that's where they can't keep up. You can't build 5-star student residence halls, and so at some point, without it continuing to expand the tuition. So that's where I think that a lot of universities are really going to be pinched. So I think that's a good point. Yeah, John.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to thank David for the term spatial engineering. I think I'm going to steal it from you. No. And actually, I think we agree on that vision. There are different definitions of architecture through the whole history of mankind. You can go from the first beginning of the written treatise of architecture from Vitruvius during the Roman Empire. He used to say that the architecture was the gathering of firmitas, utilitas, and venustas. So beauty, function, and firmitas has a double meaning between structure and order. And then later you can go to the past century, and Le Corbusier was saying that architecture was the wise, perfect, and magnificent management of the volumes underneath the light. I think in all that huge spectrum of definitions of architecture, architecture keeps the common ground of being solving problems for people through the definition of and manipulation of space. So according to that, yeah, architecture is pretty much spatial engineering, that term. So pretty much is the thing that I just wanted to highlight. And also, I think that those terms of space that we have physically in this material world can go also to the metaverse, to the virtual world as well.
Yeah, and if you take that phrase, spatial X, then you've redesigned the whole curriculum and the whole learning experience. And you don't need these little silos anymore because they're all being thought about under spatial studies.
Yeah, very good point. Mm-hmm. Very good point. Well, and I know that, Gray, you've been talking about this double helix model where the experiences and skill building is just as important as the content. So I think that fits right in to what you're talking about. We're almost out of time, so I have one more question. For us here in Hong Kong, last night was the first session for the ISCN. Some of it may be earlier this morning for you, but one of the concepts or one of the thoughts that comes up is the role of the university, and we have a role to play with, I think one of the things I remember that came up last night was, how the universities can continue to play a role with the state governments or the city governments, and how we can help train and so forth. It strikes me that quite often our ability to influence the local governments depends on our footprint. The bigger you are, the more powerful, the more people you have employed, the greater voice you have within that government. And so perhaps, a few more doors will open. If we do become a lot more decentralized, do we still have the same kind of potential for influence and impact in policy, especially if we want to use our research and our perspective to try to influence public policy? Does that diminish? Does that go up, go down? Maybe just, is it different? How does that work?
I would say it's shifting in the sense where I'm seeing now where a lot of new knowledge was created at universities, went out into the commercial world, and was basically extrapolated over the last 20 years. I'm seeing that shift now moving back. I'm seeing the center of importance for R&D across the board moving back into academic research because of all the new technologies, but how those technologies are going to be applied to politics, to economics, to behavioral studies, to philosophy, to ethics and morality. I mean, all these different areas, right? There's a lot of work that I do on the research side. And I see the amount of money moving into academic research is huge. My budgets have been almost doubling over the last 3 years, every year. So there's a lot of pushback into it because it is non-political, it is non-commercial.
Right.
And this is where a lot of our funding comes from governments, corporations, but a lot of it comes from governments, intelligence agencies as well, but governments, because they really want to know how they're going to do their role in the future. And their role is not only handling, the bottom 25% or the top 25%. It's really handling that middle 50%. And in Asia is going to have the fastest growing middle class over the next 10 to 15 years. There's going to see rapid economic, political, and social development here in Asia, which means that the student body is going to increase and the thirst for knowledge is going to increase. But a lot of that's coming from the government side. So I think the way to protect universities is really to get back into really well-funded R&D programs that have a policy angle, not only the startup angle and that whole thing, but really to have policy innovation labs on how governments or structures like that are really going to manage this rapid changing environment that we're moving into over the next 15 to 20 years.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. I do worry that universities have lost a bit of our influence over time. We've, there's a term, oh, it's all academic. That's a real insult now. That's not said, in a positive way. It's basically saying you guys are talking about something that doesn't matter. So,
but I think it's coming back though. Corporates took it over for the last 20 years because they had all the money. But I think it's moving back because corporates are biased and because of the technocracy and all the whatever around that, they're losing their trust factor. Where academics, I think, are increasing their trust factors.
Okay. Well, that clearly is, that would be a positive development if we could continue to build up that trust factor so that we're, a really respected kind of crutch for local governments, state governments. And especially, as you said, Asia, this is going to make or break our sustainability goals. 4 out of 5 people in this world is an Asian, so this is ground zero. We need to get this right. And especially because things are happening so fast, so rapidly. There's a lot of pressure on us that we're putting on ourselves to try to be relevant, try to be, important players in this realm. All right. Well, I hate to say it, but I think we've run out of time. And well, first of all, let me just thank thank the three of you, David and Gray and John. What a great discussion. I just loved every minute of it. It was fantastic. For all the participants on the Zoom call, thank you for joining us. I know that for some of you, it might be late at night. Some of you, it's early in the morning. But thanks for spending an hour and a half with us today. I think we really appreciated your thoughts and your comments. And I hope that perhaps we can continue to have this conversation. I think we're just really scratching the surface of this, and we're going to be talking about this quite a bit more over the next several years. So I guess with that said, I think we will call it a day. So thank you all. I think that if I understand right, this has been recorded. It will be available if anyone ever wants to go back and see it again, or if you want to share it with your friends, please feel free to. So, all right, thank you everybody. Hope to see you at the next event.